You did well today.
I know he did. He's the best horse.
Silas McCall had lived alone in the High Lonesome for so many winters that the creak of a stagecoach wheel was a foreign sound, until the day it delivered his mail-order bride to the dusty crossroads of Broken Spur. He had ridden to the matrimonial agency out of a tired loneliness that gnawed deeper than hunger, asking only for a sturdy woman who wouldn't mind the isolation and could keep a cabin warm. The agent's reply had been evasive, mentioning a girl named Darcy who was practical and available immediately, which should have been Silas's first, warning that something wasn't quite right. When the coach door swung open and Darcy stepped down, the first thing Silas noticed was the heavy limp she tried to hide by gripping the doorframe with white knuckles and a stubborn set of her jaw. She was tall and raw-boned, with a face full of freckles that the sun had kissed too hard, and her hair was the color of winter straw pulled back in a severe bun that added nothing soft to her appearance. The townsfolk of Broken Spur gathered like vultures on a fence rail, whispering that McCall had been sent to dregs, the bride nobody else would take, and Silas felt his pride curl up and die. He tipped his hat stiffly and introduced himself, and she replied in a voice that was surprisingly low and calm. "I know I ain't what you ordered, Mr. McCall, but I'll work harder than any woman you'd have picked." Silas loaded her single battered trunk into the wagon, noticing it was heavier than a trunk of dresses ought to be, and the ride up to his mountain cabin was a silent trial of awkward glances and unspoken disappointment. He stole looks at her limp and wondered if she'd even be able to fetch water from the creek, while Darcy stared at the pine-clad ridges with an expression that seemed to be measuring the landscape for something other than scenery. The cabin was rough and bachelor bare, and when she limped inside, she immediately ran her finger over the dusty mantle and said, "First thing tomorrow, this place gets a scrubbing that'll make it shine like a new button." Silas grunted, still nursing the bitter root of having been matched with a woman nobody else wanted. But that night she cooked him a venison stew with wild herbs she'd gathered during the journey, and he had to admit it was the best meal he'd eaten in years. She didn't simper or try to flirt, and when he made a clumsy comment about her limp, she fixed him with gray eyes that were entirely unapologetic and said, "A stallion threw me when I was 15, shattered my hip, and the doctor said I'd never walk again. But here I am proving him a liar every day." The words hit Silas like a mule kick, and for the first time he looked at her not as a defective bride, but as a survivor who had dragged herself out of a grave most folks would have lain down in. The first real test came at the end of the first week when a frantic neighbor rode up shouting that the notorious Black Stallion, called Diablo, had broken through fences and was tearing apart the lower pasture, and no man could get near him. Silas grabbed his lariat and rifle, but Darcy stepped in front of him with a calmness that was almost eerie and said, "Don't shoot that horse, Silas. Just take me down there and I'll settle him." He nearly laughed at the absurdity of a limping woman with a hip that wouldn't bend properly, thinking she could handle a stallion that had killed 2 ranch hands down in the valley last spring, but something in her voice made him hitch the wagon. When they reached the pasture, Diablo was a whirlwind of black fury, nostrils flared red, hooves striking sparks off the stones, and the gathered men scattered like quail at the sight of him charging the fence line. Darcy limped forward with no rope, no whip, only a calm humming sound low in her throat, and Silas lunged to pull her back, but she shot him a glance that pinned him in place like a driven nail. She walked directly into the stallion's line of sight, not head-on, but at a soft angle, her body language speaking some ancient language that the horse understood because he stopped his charge mid-stride and cocked his head. The men watching from the ridge fell dead silent as Darcy continued her slow, unhurried approach, her limp somehow steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat, her humming never wavering even when Diablo snorted a cloud of steam inches from her face. Silas's heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears, but he didn't move because what he was witnessing felt more like a prayer than a horse taming, a communion between 2 creatures who both knew what it meant to be called broken. Diablo's ears swiveled forward, the the wild white of his eyes receding, and when Darcy raised her hand, palm out, the massive Stallion stretched his neck and blew a soft breath into her cupped palm like a foal greeting its dam. She stroked the velvet of his nose and murmured words that the wind carried away, and within 5 more minutes, the killer stallion was following her around the pasture like an overgrown puppy, his fury completely spent. Silas heard old Jim Bridger whisper behind him, "That woman knows more about horses than any man in this territory ever will." And the words fell over Silas like a bucket of cold, clarifying water. He saw her then not as a woman with a limp and a plain face, but as a creature of rare God-given genius who had been tossed aside by a world too blind to recognize her worth. That evening, after the stallion was safely penned and Darcy had washed the dust from her hands, Silas sat across from her at the rough-hewn table and said, "I owe you an apology, Darcy, because I was just as blind as all those other fools." She looked up, a strand of straw-colored hair falling across her cheek, and replied, "Most folks see the limp before they see the person, Silas, but you're starting to look past it, and that means more than you could ever know." From that day on, word spread like wildfire across the territory that Silas McCall's unwanted bride could gentle any horse ever foaled. And soon ranchers were riding from 3 counties over with their most dangerous mounts, coin purses ready. Darcy worked with each horse patiently, never raising her voice or using harsh bits, and Silas built a proper training corral and a small barn while marveling at the woman his clumsy letter had somehow summoned out of the vast, indifferent prairie. He learned her story in fragments over the following months. She'd been a blacksmith's daughter in Ohio, her mother dead of fever, her father the only one who'd seen her gift before he passed and left her to a stepbrother who sold her to the agency the moment she became inconvenient. Every night they sat on the porch and she taught him the language of horses, how a flick of an ear was a paragraph and a swish of tail a whole chapter, and Silas discovered his own hands could learn gentleness he'd never been taught. The pile of money from her horse training grew, and with it, they bought that same bottomland Silas had once coveted, fencing it properly and bringing in a string of quality mares to breed with the now gentle Diablo, who had become Darcy's constant shadow. Silas noticed that Darcy's limp seemed less pronounced when she was around horses, as if the animals lent her some of their own fluid strength, and he realized that the limp was not a weakness, but a compass pointing to where her power lay. One night, after a long day of working a particularly difficult Mustang, Darcy fell asleep in the rocking chair with her head tilted back, and Silas covered her with a quilt and looked at her face in the firelight, seeing only beauty where once he'd seen lack. He kissed her forehead softly, and she stirred, blinking up at him with those steady gray eyes. And before he could retreat, she caught his hand and said, "I was beginning to think you'd never get around to that, Silas McCall." They were married properly by the traveling preacher under a canopy of golden aspen leaves, and Darcy wore a new calico dress, the color of bluebonnets, while Diablo pranced at the edge of the ceremony like a self-appointed best man. The ranchers who attended brought gifts of tack and foals, and Jim Bridger gave a speech that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure when he declared that Silas had gotten the best bride in the territory by accident because nobody else had the sense to want her. Darcy's reputation grew until the territorial governor himself sent a vicious cavalry reject for her to gentle, and she turned the beast into a parade-worthy mount in under 2 weeks without ever raising her voice above a whisper. A newspaperman from Denver came to write a story about her, and when he asked the secret of her gift, she just shrugged and said, "Horses don't care about limps or scars. They only care about the truth you carry in your heart, and I never lied to them." The article made her famous for a season, but Darcy paid the fame no mind and continued mucking stalls and training colts exactly as she had before, her straw-colored hair always escaping its bun by midday. Silas watched her one morning, working a shivering yearling that had been mistreated, her hands moving slowly, her voice a low croon, and he felt a swell of love so vast it seemed the entire valley couldn't contain it. That night, he told her, You're the most remarkable person I've ever known, Darcy. And I thank God every day that the agency sent you to me instead of some pretty, useless girl who'd have folded at the first hard winter." She laughed and punched his shoulder, calling him a silver-tongued flatterer. But her eyes shone with a quiet joy that no money or fame could ever duplicate because it came from being truly seen. A rival horse trainer from Cheyenne showed up one autumn, a loud man named Braxton who challenged Darcy to a gentling contest, certain that a woman couldn't possibly match his years of professional experience. Darcy met him at dawn in the town square where the crowd gathered, and while Braxton used whips and harsh bits and shouted commands, she simply stood still and let the frightened horse come to her, and within an hour the animal was following her around like a lamb. Braxton conceded defeat with a face as red as a rooster's comb, and Silas lifted Darcy onto Diablo's bare back while the whole town cheered, her limp completely irrelevant on the back of a horse that once wanted to kill everything. They used their prosperity to help other outcasts, taking in orphan boys and runaway girls who needed a safe place, and Darcy taught every one of them how to listen to horses and, in doing so, how to listen to their own hearts. Silas built a bunkhouse and a schoolroom, and the laughter of children filled the valley that had once known only the silence of one lonely man and his regret. In the evenings, Darcy and Silas would sit on the porch and watch their ragtag family doing chores, and she would rest her head on his shoulder and say, "Not bad for an unwanted bride and a mountain man who thought he'd been cheated, is it?" He would kiss the top of her head and reply, "Darcy, you were never unwanted. You were just waiting for a man with enough sense to see that your limp was a gate the angels gave you, so you'd walk slower and let the rest of us catch up." When the first grandchild arrived, a boy with his grandmother's gray eyes, Darcy placed him on the back of a gentle old pony and led him around the corral, while the family gathered to watch the legacy of her gift being passed on. She grew old with the same stubborn grace with which she gentled Diablo, her limp more pronounced now, but her spirit entirely untamed, and her knowledge of horses deeper than any book ever written on the subject. Silas, his beard gone white as mountain snow, still looked at her with the awe of that first day in the pasture when she'd walked into the storm and calmed it with nothing but her presence and her truth. On their 40th anniversary, the town unveiled a small bronze statue in the square, a woman with a slight limp, hand extended, and a wild stallion bending his head to touch her palm. The plaque reading simply, "Darcy McCall, she saw what others missed." Darcy stood before the statue with tears running down her weathered cheeks and said, "They got the horse right, but they made me too pretty." And Silas laughed until his sides hurt and told her she'd always been the most beautiful thing in his world. When she passed on a quiet spring morning with the sound of foals nickering in the pasture, Silas buried her under the aspen grove where they'd married and planted a wild rose bush that bloomed the exact color of the calico dress she'd worn that day. He lived another 2 years, spending his days telling their story to anyone who'd listen. And when he finally joined her, the whole territory mourned the passing of an era and the love that had defined it. The ranch still runs today under the hands of their descendants, and every horse bred on that land carries a gentleness that comes from a lineage of understanding rather than fear, a gift passed down from a woman nobody wanted. Visitors to the valley often ask why the horses there are so remarkably calm and willing, and the answer always begins with the tale of a mountain man who accidentally got the bride nobody else would take, but who knew more about horses than any man in the territory. So if you ever feel like the world has overlooked your worth, remember Darcy McCall and the Stallion no one could touch, and know that the very thing they call your flaw might be the key to a greatness they can't yet imagine. Thank you for riding with Darcy and Silas through this tale of unexpected worth and wild-forged love. And if this story stirred something in your heart, please subscribe to West Old Stories Official right now so you never miss another Frontier legend. We read every single comment, so tell us what moment touched you most. Drop a like to honor the unwanted who become unforgettable, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that their difference is their destiny.